Good evening and welcome. Welcome everyone to a very special session here at Devex's annual coverage of the UN General Assembly's week here in New York, a week that every year gets bigger, more dynamic. And for all of you who are here in this room, and for those of you who are following us online, thank you for being a part of all of the many stories we're bringing to you. This event is really a special one. We're very interested, as I think all of you are, in big new ideas, right? If you're here at the UN General Assembly week in New York, the thing most people ask me when they stop me at a cocktail reception is, what are you hearing? You know, what's the latest? What's the new thing? The new thing today is that development finance and peace actually go together. This is not something you might naturally think. When you think about development finance, you might think of roads and bridges. You might think of investments of all kinds. You might not think about peace building and fragility. But we're going to try to change that in the conversation today, in part because the Secretary General of the UN has changed his mind on this. In fact, there's a new agenda around development finance and peace you're going to learn a little bit about. And it's a big idea with some big backers who are going to join us on stage. In fact, this event is brought to you by Devex in partnership with the African Development Bank and UNHCR. We're thrilled to be working with them to bring it to you. I'm going to have in a moment our first speaker here so we can have a conversation, but I just want to share with you 3 pieces of good news. If you are an African leader here in the room, I'm not even going to add to this list the fact that we have a cocktail reception at the end of the night for those who are here. Stick around for that. But there are 3 pieces of good news I want to share with you. The first is, this is a week when you can come to events like this and hear a lot of doom and gloom about the continent of Africa. We have on stage shortly Africa's optimist in chief. So you're not going to get doom and gloom tonight. You also know this is a moment when raising funds for global development is particularly tough. And arguments are being made in capital cities in Europe and here in the US. And one of the big themes is migration, right? That's one of the big fears you hear. Well, the person I'm about to have on stage has a vision for young Africans having a bright future in Africa. And you're going to hear more about that. And finally, the last piece of good news is, if you're in this room and you're thinking about running for the presidency of the African Development Bank, you don't have to run against Akinwumi Adesina. He can't run again. So you got a shot. You got a shot. With that, I want to bring up President Adesina. I'd love to join you on stage for a conversation, sir. Please join me. So I say that in jest, of course, but this is your last year. When we get together here at the UN General Assembly next year, there'll be somebody else in your seat. You've served 10 years in this role.
Right.
You've, I think, more than tripled the capital of the bank. You've got a lot of initiatives underway, including electrification. But this one was a little new to me, this idea that the African Development Bank can make a real dent in the challenge of peace in a region where peace is in short supply right now. Tell me more about this initiative and this agenda.
Well, first and foremost, let me say that it's a personal issue for me, the work that we do in areas that are affected by conflict. And when you have a lot of displaced populations, IDPs, they didn't choose to be displaced populations. They didn't choose to be IDPs. And so their life shouldn't end just because of that. And we make this bifurcation or division. This is humanitarian and this is development. Well, you can't dismember people, right? They just find themselves in different situations that are transitory. And so all we have to do is to make sure that we connect that, make sure that you meet people where they are, deploy your development programs to them where they are, customize your instruments to meet the needs of those communities, and then build a system that allows them to transition. That's how you have resilience. Resilience is not about you getting the shock, it's your ability to recover from a shock. And so that's how I look at it. In fact, I tell my folks that, the double problems that you have when you are displaced, you're displaced from all your families, from all the places all of a sudden then financing is displaced, education is displaced, and jobs are displaced. No, we have to connect and build ecosystems of support to build resilience from those that suffer from different kind of challenges, whether it's because of conflict, whether it's because of climate change, whether it's because of any other problems. But we have to connect, put our hands together, and support folks to be able to reintegrate and get their lives back together again.
Let's get concrete if we can. Tell us a little bit more about what are some examples where you can do this? Because I can think of countries where the African Development Bank wants to have a good partner in a government, a stable partner, and wants to think about long-term investments in infrastructure. But a lot of the situations we're talking about are very fragile. You may have cases where it's unclear who the government even is. It might be contested, right? Active conflict in some parts of the continent. Now, how are you envisioning using the resources of the African Development Bank Group to target the needs of people in these truly fragile situations?
Okay, so let's take one of our projects that we have. Is a project wherein we in DRC Congo. You have DRC Congo, you have also Central African Republic. So it's a project that is connecting them in water, transboundary water management that affects these populations. Or you go to a place like in Sudan, right, where Sudan right now has a refugee population of about what 10 million people. Though you find those they are in Chad, and you find them also in South Sudan and all of those people. But we have a project there on wheat. And by the way, it's heat-tolerant wheat varieties that have actually helped Sudan to lower its food imports by 50%, right? And the varieties were actually given to those IDP populations, so they benefit directly from that. Just today, before walking in here, our board just approved today a project in South Sudan, which is to support women that are actually refugee populations directly with interventions on skills, entrepreneurship, financing for them. So that's one other example. But I want to take something else just to segue into this conversation to see where I stand in this. So, for example, you go to Niger, Chad, Mali, Burkina Faso, you have a lot of countries that are affected by insecurity, conflict, with terrorism, I want to say. So what you find in all these places is that expenditure on security continues to rise. And the expenditures on development financing for water, education, sanitation, all the things we care about continues to fall. Now, the issue is, how are they going to rebuild unless they have a financial system that allows them to get out of that? So, but then we get told multilateral development banks, well, you don't have to worry about that. Leave it to the UN. Well, the UN Security Council was set up to deal with interstate conflicts, not the kind of things that come out of what we are facing today. It's climate driven. It's ethnic driven. It's challenges that leads to people to move. And so I believe then that we need to find financial instruments that allows countries to be able to have resources to rebuild damaged infrastructure in areas of conflict. We've put in more than $55 billion into infrastructure in the last 7, 8 years. But question is, in areas of conflict, you have schools that have been damaged, water sanitation, energy that's been damaged, hospitals, all those things. So we are therefore launching this thing called Security Index Investment Bonds, which are long-term vehicles that allow you to raise long-term capital, low interest rate, that will be used to do 4 things. First is to support the capacity within those countries just to protect themselves. I'm not talking of guns or anything like that, just basically human capacity, your intelligence, and all those kind of things, but not guns, because articles forbids us from getting to those particular areas. The second is repairing infrastructure that have been damaged in areas of conflict, right? And then repairing also social infrastructure in particular that have been damaged. And lastly is to protect themselves in areas where they have their assets. It really beats me that you can't go to somewhere like Saudi Arabia and walk into areas where they have their oil fields because they're well protected.
Yeah.
But here we supported Mozambique. We actually structured on the Africa Investment Forum the liquefied natural gas project in Mozambique for $24 billion. Just shortly after that, the whole place was taken over, right? No, so we think that there has to be a way of protecting areas where these countries have their assets, right? We can't just continue to have a situation where this goes on. So that's the big innovation that we brought in, is the security index investment bonds that allows these things to raise capital for them to rebuild. Because if you don't rebuild, when terrorists come into those areas and they find there are no schools, there's no water, there's no sanitation, population that are not happy, then there's no social political capital for them. So terrorists just take over that place, and we can't continue to have that.
Yeah, I think of the case of your own home country, Nigeria, right? And there are other countries you mentioned that have a similar situation where the government in power has control, but not over all of the territory. Mm-hmm. And what do you do in that case? And it sounds like this is an approach to say, we're going to bolster that government's ability to make a case to populations who are living in or near contested areas that the government has something to offer, that this democracy can deliver.
Yes, yes. And one more thing I want to say also is, education is everything. I am bothered by the fact that we have large numbers of populations of displaced children, out of school children. They just run into, millions and millions of that. And I was talking to the Filipino, about this, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees about this, that we need to move away from projectized approach of trying to solve that problem to a more regional approach. All right. So how many kids are we talking about? Which zones are we talking about? What are we going to do to rebuild all the infrastructure in all those damaged areas? Right. What are we going to do in terms of financial structure to support the families of those kids where they are? What are we going to do to develop, training programs for them, right, to be able to get the girls or the boys, to be able to get good learning there, and this is very, very important. And I'm particularly, yesterday I was given he for she award made a he for she champion, because I really think that women and girls are the ones that are most affected in these conflict areas. So how do you get the girl child to be able to go back to school, to feel safe in going back to school? So I feel that we're going to launch a major program, and I was talking to the High Commissioner about it, which will include comprehensive support for out-of-school children, rebuild the infrastructure, put financial structures around them, and make sure they can get their life together and get back to school.
Well, that's big news. And in fact, you mentioned him. Let's invite him on stage. We have Filippo Grande here with us, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Come and join us here, Filippo, for this conversation. Have a seat, please. Please. There's a mic behind you. You want to grab it? Aki's already mentioned this, that there's this artificial silo between the humanitarian space and the development space. I understand the two of you have met today for the first time in person. I know you've met before. You are working together. You're partnering. That's part of the news we're here to share. And this silo has to break in places like DRC, in places like Central African Republic, where there's no way to operate. Where is that division? So I want to hear from you, Filippo. This is a moment when it's very hard to get financing from donor governments. The politics are bad. Everyone's out there raising money. And the two of you are here with something that sounds new. It sounds different. What is it about your approach that people ought to pay attention to in capitals around the world?
Thank you. I think that the first thing that I should say is that, of course, we're talking about this type of partnership in a refugee context. Clearly, that's the context in which I operate, my organization operates. So let's stay with that. But it is applicable to other humanitarian contexts as well. But first of all, that context is a context in which crises, plural, are increasing. I think we need to be clear about that. I was impressed to hear that during your time at during your 10 years, I can't remember the number of times the capital increased.
I think it's 3 times.
3 times. In my not yet 10, 9 years, the only thing that increased is the number of refugees. So this is a bad joke. Actually, it's a sad reality. But in reality, the resources that are made available to respond to this crisis have increased. Donors have made huge efforts, but not at the same pace. And I always, I think that you talked about silos. I think the silos are crumbling because of one clear realization that it is certainly a matter of how much money is spent to save lives but it is increasingly also what type of money is spent to do that and for what purpose. Because humanitarian aid is by definition short-lived, not sustainable, and aimed really at the most basic immediate requirements. Unfortunately, because the crises I'm talking about never go away, are extremely protracted. Think of Somali refugees, 30 years, Afghan refugees, I'm talking about other areas as well, and many others. The dependency on resources that decline or are stagnant or are not promoting self-reliance is catastrophic. And this is why these partnerships are becoming imperative. And this is why I think we're very fast breaking those silos. And surely, I am very excited that we have a growing partnership with the African Development Bank. By the way, we're already working together in many parts of Africa. But I think that it could also be a model for many other such partnerships if we really work together towards this sustainability of what we want to do.
Yeah, I guess when you think about this challenge of scarcity of resources and growing needs, it's a very tough political environment to raise money. I know you're trying to replenish the African Development Fund. $25 billion is what you're looking for. So is the World Bank. They're trying to replenish IDA. You have all the global health verticals that are out there looking for their funding. All have very good cases to make. But we are still living in this world of silos. And I think you're here telling us that there's a different way forward. What is the argument you're making that the ADF and that this approach can change the trajectory in countries we might otherwise think are just going to continue to be fragile?
Yeah, a big thing in Africa is about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, okay? So you got 54 countries that, we say we're going to integrate, but you cannot integrate fragile economies. You have to integrate resilient economies, right? And therefore, investing in building resilience is critical to overall economic growth for what we're trying to do. And that's how we see it. And the vehicle that we have to do that is the African Development Fund. The African Development Fund, at our last replenishment, as you know, we raised $8.9 billion, which is the highest we've ever raised in the history of the fund. But, the guys who run it, I can see the lights. My vice president is there, Yero is there, who do all the work on transition states. We have something under the fund that is called Transition Support Facility, which is to support places like in DRC or whether Central African Republic or Sudan or South Sudan or areas where you have a lot of conflict, or even in Côte d'Ivoire when they had a lot of their conflict. We supported them and supported Côte d'Ivoire to recover, and they moved straight from a fragile state straight to the commercial window of the bank, which is the first country ever in history to actually have achieved that. So that transition support facility is very, very important. It also has a crisis response facility that is targeted to the particular needs of the country. So the case that we are making is this. One of the reasons why you have refugees and all of this displaced is because of climate change. Okay, so Africa today loses $7 billion to $15 billion a year from climate change. If that doesn't change, it's going to grow $50 billion a year. Those that are most affected are those in fragile environments, right? Where they already suffer degradation, very, very poor households. So one of the things in the ADF that we are doing is to provide 20 million farmers with access to climate information, climate services, okay? Then another 20 million farmers and herders, livestock herders, like you have in East Africa and so on, to be able to have crop and livestock insurance, right? Then we're going to use those resources to also support the rehabilitation of over 1 million hectares of degraded land. So if you take the whole of East African, Horn of Africa, Somalia, Sudan, and all of those places. and then provide basic water and sanitation for more than 18 million people, and then energy for about 9.8 million people. So that is very, very compelling. Now, in addition to that, we have created something under the African the Development Fund called a Climate Action Window. We are the first constitutional financial institution to be able to do that, right? So we think that if you're looking to put your money to get to folks in areas that are going through fragility, the African Development Fund has shown itself consistently. It's Africa-based. It's Africa-owned. We don't leave any areas of conflict. We don't have that luxury of leaving a country. I'm President of African Development Bank. I don't have a choice to say, well, I go to any other country in the world. I've got to stay there, And I remember when I visited and you and I are going to go there to Central Africa Republic. And, and I really credit my guys because I was coming there to say, well, they wanted me to visit the office. These guys were working in very, very difficult areas. They were living in a container. I mean, the office was in a container. We were in South Sudan, and all of that. So the point I just want to make while I have my brother with me, Philip, is that we do all this work, but we do need to begin to have cover of the UN to protect my staff, right? I can expand work into fragile areas, but I've got to be able to protect them and get them out when I want to get them out. So that's one thing I've told the UN Secretary General, but I'll put it back also with you. So that's the case we're making. But I believe that we need to now raise the African Development Fund financing to $25 billion. And one of the things why that's important is energy. President of the World Bank and I, Ajay Banga, got together, and I said to Ajay, look, Ajay, it makes no sense that Africa has 600 million people without electricity. None. You got 300,000 women dying every year, 200,000 kids dying every year because you have 900 million women that have no access to clean cooking energy, right? Most of those are in low-income, fragile states. And so we launched what is called Mission 300, which is to connect 300 million Africans to electricity by 2030. Most of those will come from the Sahelian areas, Niger, Chad, Mali, Burkina Faso, where we have a big program called Desert to Power to essentially develop 10,000 megawatts of solar power that will provide electricity for 250 million people. And when we're done with it, it will be the largest solar zone in the world. So for all those reasons, providing water, sanitation, education, rebuilding infrastructure, providing access to climate information, and also making sure that we can reintegrate refugee populations in many of these areas, and also develop and launch and scale up security index investment funds. For all those reasons, if you're here and you want to put up money, I can tell you there's no better place to put your money than the African Development Fund to make it $25 billion. Yes.
I see why they call you optimist in chief. I can see it. Filippo, I wonder, you talked earlier about just how challenging the environment is. And one of the things that you and other leaders of the UN humanitarian agencies have tried to do is to find ways to bring in the private sector. And I wonder if this kind of a partnership with DFIs that know how to do that have mechanisms for doing it, bonds, direct investments, equity investments, and others, is there a way together that you can actually crack that nut that you've been working on for a long time, I know, to bring more private sector money to address the challenges of IDPs?
Yeah. Can I, before I answer that question, make some further comments to some of the points made earlier, in particular two. One is that, it's interesting that my mandate as High Commissioner for Refugees is, of course, what everybody knows: protecting refugees, avoiding pushbacks, refoulements, we call it, access to asylum. This is the protection heart of the organization. But then, my mandate, as per the statute of my organization, is to help governments, work with governments in finding solutions to problems of displacement. This is the less known but equally important part of the job. We're not about keeping people in displacement forever, or refugees forever. We need to find ways so that one day they're not, as soon as possible, they're not refugees anymore. Now, the best is that they go back voluntarily to their countries, but there are other options. President Ruto, I was telling you, President Ruto, for example, in Kenya, when he became president, he called us and he said, look, we have 600,000 refugees in Kenya. And we've tried everything. We've tried to send them to other countries. Nobody wants them. We tried to send them back to their countries. Impossible. Somalia is still too fragile. South Sudan, equally. These are the main places of origin. So he said, what about trying to make these people part of our communities? And that's valuable. That's an incredible example. But both returning to their places, and this would be the case in the Central African Republic, where the president, the government want people to go back, or making them part of the communities in the place where they are. These are essentially development challenges. This is where I think it's very, very important that we work together. And by the way, development challenges, and I come to your question, Raj, development challenges in fragile settings, because unfortunately we're not talking anymore of perfect solutions where there is a fantastic peace that will last forever and stability and the great economy and all that. All these places, we're looking for solutions in very, very very complex environment. If yesterday I met with the president of the Central, we discussed this point. He's ready. He said, remember, he told me, this is not just helping people go back, so rebuilding their houses, their schools, their health centers, but it's also, restoring social cohesion between people that have gone away for a long time, sometimes during a conflict, and come back and have to rebuild also the coexistence with their own community. So it's a very complex exercise solving displacement, where without development, we cannot succeed. However, it means, and that's what Akinwumi was saying, it means that development has to adapt to situations of fragility. That's one of the biggest challenges, because we humanitarians are used to that. We can navigate, work, the dangerous situation, but for development, it's much more challenging. Even the way funds are disbursed, programs are carried out, you said it, Raj, with fragile governments that are not very well equipped. So all these, and this is, and I close with your answer, this is particularly challenging for the private sector, because the private sector, by definition, is not a great risk taker. Sure. I'm not an expert, but it's quite obvious. Therefore, how do you induce the private sector to come? Because we're not talking about philanthropy here. We're not talking, although it's great, by the way, if anybody wants to make donations, these are always welcome. But this is not just about philanthropy, giving money to a program. This is about partnering with us. And I can talk a long time about incredible examples of such partnerships. In southern Ethiopia, the IKEA Foundation, which is one of our biggest private sector partners, and us have together set up with the local authorities a community development project, refugees, local community, which is a model of sustainability. In Kakuma, Kenya, we have worked now for years with mostly the Kenyan private sector to invest in a very fragile area, employing refugees and host communities. We're changing the face of one of the worst refugee camps in Africa, becoming a very progressive settlement with economic opportunities. So it is possible, but it is still quite niche. Partnering with institutions like the African Development Bank, that has also experience, undoubtedly, working with the private sector, will be very, very important.
Can I just say something about the the populations that are received in the receiving countries, right? As we look at how we finance countries, we need to find a way, because they are providing essentially a public good, right? So if you have a lot of refugee populations and you have a lot of displaced people, and those people now create a lot of insecurity, you have a regional spillover of insecurity, which if it affects the other countries, then the weighted average risk rating of all our portfolio in all those places will rise. Okay, so it becomes a problem, right? So it's in our interest actually to figure out a way of giving discounted interest support you lower your interest rate of lending to those countries to build the infrastructure they need to do and to support those refugee populations so that they can be better integrated, have jobs, and so on. So I'm making a case that we should have a differential interest rate for that to be able to do, because they are overwhelmed by the sheer number of things that we're dealing with here. The other one is with regard to the issue of the populations there. If you take a look at the refugee population, the size of the market itself, that was an assessment that was done, was about almost $485 billion, right? And so that's an economy that they themselves need to participate in. There needs to be finance, so access to skills, digital skills, access to small and medium-sized enterprises, access to capital is very, very important. Making sure that those skills are built so when they have to go back to their countries, they can reintegrate back into it. So all I'm saying is that we have projects that are financed by the bank that are actually supporting economic activities specifically dedicated to the refugee populations here.
Yeah, that's an important point, and we're going to expand this conversation and go a little further into that discussion. Ultimately, we're going to expand it to all of you, so get ready with your questions. But I want to ask our two next speakers to join us on stage, and we'll just shift down if that's okay. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Campbell and Letitia Courtois to the stage, please. I'll just pass this down to you. Sure. Thanks for joining us. You've heard this conversation advance here, and I'll just say a word about who you are. Elizabeth Campbell is, of course, the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department in the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration. So these are issues you work on every day, Elizabeth. This idea of risk and sort of changing the risk dynamic is interesting to me, that we have Filippo, who represents the biggest risk takers. He has no choice. It's in his mandate. He and his people go where it's risky, right? But they go there. Now you have the African Development Bank, which is seen by private sector as willing to take a lot more risks than they are and helps bring them in. And so now we have this sort of a continuum, if you imagine this partnership. And I wonder how you see that. Is this a new way of thinking about this nexus between development, humanitarian, and ultimately driving toward peace?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I would say it's not a new way of thinking. I would say the urgency around having to make progress on this agenda is new, because it's so obvious that, and you mentioned this in the beginning, we are not going to continue to just raise copious amounts of additional resources across the board. That's not a likely outcome. And so if that is a reality that we accept, the answer has to be that all of us here have to work completely differently. And it's very difficult. It requires a lot of energy. But we, I think, believe that's the way forward. The Secretary of State hosted an event on Monday, and the intention of that event, where he brought together private sector, several banks, the UN, civil society partners, obviously governments and others, was to say, this is the coalition, this is the way forward, this is how together we are going to tackle problems in the 21st century. It can't just be about resources, it's about how we use these resources together, how we bring the technical capacities together, and how we bring the really sort of outcome-based thinking in countries and regions together.
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversation about innovation in the humanitarian space, but it's hard to do it on your own if you're in the humanitarian space, if you don't have some of the tools that development finance can bring to the table. I wonder what your thought is about that, Elizabeth. You are the permanent observer of the ICRC here at the UN in the New York delegation. Tell us a little bit about this, where you think the humanitarian development nexus kind of can go.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone.
Letitia, I'm sorry, Letitia. I called you Elizabeth. Letitia.
Fine. I like Elizabeth, it's fine. Look, of course, the partnership is very natural somehow, because the conflicts where my organization, the ICRC, work are also happening. They're not happening in a vacuum. It's cities, it's network that pre-exist that are suddenly disrupted. And on those emergency moments, you need to find the best way to support those that are in a particularly vulnerable situation. So we don't arrive in a vacuum. We don't arrive in a place where suddenly you have to rebuild everything. You have to understand the environment and try to make those connections that will build on the resilience of people and allow them to find a way to move forward, find an economy, a sustainable income, reconnect with their way of working, or find something else to do if they are in a moment of displacement. And also help the local authorities who also have the manpower, the knowledge, the connection as well to the service providers, to the private lines the providers as well that will keep coming and that are outside of the capacity also of humanitarians to replace. This is, I think it's a bit of an illusion if we think that we can fix and then come and then just put a patch on communities. You also have to see that many conflicts today are happening in cities. So this urbanization of conflicts are extremely disrupting because the first thing often that happens is the suspension of the essential services. Essential services, infrastructure are damaged, they are broken, but they need to support thousands and thousands of people. So we need to immediately connect. And for that, I think you need to come with a bit of a humble approach. The humanitarians will make the bridge, will facilitate some moments that are particularly difficult to cope with because providers are stopped from entering a specific place, like we have, for instance, in Al Fashir right now in Darfur. Lack of medical supplies coming in the hospitals, but the hospitals continue to work and to support the population in the middle of a conduct of hostility that is quite destructive. And you need to continue making sure that those provision are resumed as soon as possible. That's really the role we have at time to make sure that while the people need help, we also need to facilitate that and protect as well this continuity and continuum of services that will allow the actors, the local actors, to function. And here local authorities are key. It's just an unavoidable connection, as is the local actors, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, National Society that are part of our movement and network. They're on the front line. They know how things work. And our role on the front line is often to bring back the local authority, the water services, to be able, with protection, with essentials notification, to be able to resume their work and fix the system to again support the local economy and continue providing the support that the population need to stay as well and to live.
It's so important, as you say, the context really matters. You have to deal with the realities that are on the ground. And on the ground, as we heard earlier, the humanitarian development nexus isn't really a thing in reality. It's something we've created in New York or we've created in Washington or London, but it's not reflected in the reality on the ground. But yet it's imposed in a way, and imposed in the way we're structured, in the way we're funded. And so to me, what is exciting about the potential here, the potential that was announced at the Pact for the Future, this idea of a new agenda around peace, is that maybe we can really do more to bring the tools that we've got together into one place, to kind of knit them together in a new way. And that's really what you're trying to do. I guess I ask you because this is a moment when the multilateral development banks are really very much in the spotlight. Obviously, Ajay Banga at the World Bank, but in general, there's a sense that the MDBs need to punch much further above their weight, that they need to stretch and sweat their balance sheets, that they need to crowd in much more private sector money. How does this agenda fit in to that demand that's coming from the world for MDBs to step up in a bigger way?
Well, for us, we just have to increase the quantum of money that we can use to drive the agenda that we all say sustainable development goals, right? Our context may differ, but the challenges are the same. That we all agree that we're going to have to finance the SDGs. Now, it used to be $2.5 trillion to finance the SDGs. Now it's $4 trillion. If you take a look at Africa, that means $1.3 trillion that we have to actually come up with. So the way in which we are actually doing it is, we're looking at the reform for the global financial architecture, let me say 3-4 ways. First is how do we get more concessional financing? Because if you look in low-income fragile states, right, you don't want them taking too much debt. You want them getting actually more concessional
There's
funds.
already a debt problem.
There are already a debt problem there. So there has to be a quantum leap in the amount of resources available to the African Development Fund. I've said $25 billion. RJ Bank is also raising money for IDA. So, but that concessional finance is very important for us to be able to deal with the debt. The other one, of course, is just climate finance. Many of these areas are facing a huge amount of climate shocks, right? I was just 2 days ago with the president of Malawi. I mean, one day it's drought, the other day it's flood, and so on. And you find the whole of the Sahel, Eastern African area with El Nino problems and all of this. So being able to scale up financing for climate adaptation is going to be a big thing. For us at African Development Bank, we are mobilizing $25 billion on a program called African Adaptation Acceleration Program, right? That will allow us to be able to support communities, countries to insure themselves against exogenous shocks like floods or droughts. So that's another area that's very, very important. The third one is debt. I mean, these countries don't have the fiscal space, right? And I think, therefore, we have to make sure that we deal with the Africa debt issue in a very structured way. You can't run with a pile of sand on your back, right, running up a hill. These countries need to have, look at Chad, look at the whole thing with the G20 common framework. We have to make sure those things work much faster to have debt resolution. And the other thing that I want to say with regard to many of this is just how we use contingent financing. So take the SDRs, for example, right? We want to provide 300 million people with access to electricity, right? The African Development Bank worked together with the Inter-American Development Bank to come up with a structure where the SDRs can be leveraged by 4 to 8 times. And for us, it's 4 times. Maybe in some places, it can be even more than that.
So the special drawing rights.
Special drawing rights of the IMF. Okay. So with that, if you actually had a target to give all of Africa electricity from the Sahel to anywhere, it's going to cost us $190 billion a year to do that by 2030. But if I have special drawing rights of, say, $50 billion, and you can actually put it as a part of your capital stack, it's there every year, you can leverage it. That can deliver $200 billion.
Because you can borrow against it.
Yeah, because you can borrow against it. So and that money also means that you can also support the low-income countries, the fragile states, and so on. So I think we need to also not get too structured with our instruments, right? Focus on the problem. I think if we have the SDRs used properly to leverage, we can actually get the monies to fix a lot of these challenges.
Yeah, I want to see if anybody here wants to chime in on that, but otherwise I'm going to go and see if we have people here in the audience who want to join the conversation. Just raise your hand. We'll try to take a few questions at the same time. We've got a couple in the front. There's one in the back there. There will be a microphone, I think, coming to you. You can start all the way in the back if you want. I'll just ask you to say your name, your organization, and try to keep it brief and ideally with a question mark at the end if you can. Go ahead, please.
Shall I go? Okay. Hi, my name is Seydin Kumbaraja. I'm with the World Bank's Global Partnership for Social Accountability. And so we're working on developing a new model to be able to provide direct financing to non-state actors, especially in fragile states. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on better integrating the people sector. I mean, we talked about the private sector, but better integrating the people sector, civil society organizations, community-based organizations, existing networks in communities, to be able to better address the needs of these communities in fragile states? And how can the multilateral financing system be evolving itself to be able to better do this? Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We had at this table 2 questions. We'll take them. We get a mic over. There's one coming.
Thank you very much. My name is Adetunji Anthony Adeleke, and I'm with Pristine Africa and ChimeNet. I'm so glad to hear all the feedback from all the world leaders and the development institutions. In resonance with what Dr. Additional said, we need to restructure the system But the question is, how do we develop that value-based system by which we can assess risks in new ways that are not traditional, whereby the financing part, the way the finance people look at risks is different from the way that risks are when there is a problem. So, like in a situation whereby, since we are talking of climate action, whereby like the dams, how do we maintain assets that the risk of damages to those, like the situation that happened in Nigeria and Cameroon and recently, whereby those things can be able to solve problem rather in a precautionary way rather than in a reactive way, whereby insurance is like the risk must happen before they intervene. Thank you.
Thank you. You can just pass the microphone over there. Take one more.
Thank you very much. My name is Stefano Manservisi. I'm a former Director General European Commission, and now I'm chairing the Global Fund to finance prevention of violent extremism. Now, one consideration and one question. I mean, the consideration is now we have the Pact for the Future. The Pact of the Future, in its peace and security part, maybe for the first time ever, underlines the importance of prevention, linking precisely security development, but not only security development in the old term, in a way which is underlying the importance of prevention. Now, if there is one thing which is true, and I saw that also on the basis of my experience at the Commission, to finance prevention is much more difficult than to finance development, humanitarian, and security. The real center of gravity is about people. I mean, prevention is at the end, it's not only the fragility of the society, but the fragility of people, which can turn into terrorism, radicalized. You know, this is true all across the world, in Europe, in the United States, in Africa, everywhere. Now, we have the pact now. How you, in particular, President Desina, is intending to implement it, because we have a certain number of examples in which you need, at the end, to empower communities to work at grassroots level in order to build resilience from inside. This is what the Global Fund that I chair is doing, granting money and capacity. Now, is that conceivable to have a program financed by the African Development Bank, for example, which has the title of prevention? In order to underline that it's not only fixing a crisis, but to anticipate a crisis, and then to find a way, a financial technique, in order to channel money to communities and to society, because otherwise the development fund very often do not arrive to the to the ground. Thank you.
It's a great question. It's very connected, I think, to the question from our colleague from the World Bank, which is, how do we ensure this kind of funding actually reaches people directly, whether you call it the people sector or not, CSOs, local organizations, because so often the funding is directed to state actors, official actors that may not get there. And when you're trying to address the fragility of people, how do you do that? Elizabeth, it looked like you had a thought about it.
I mean, I would just say, I think we would all very much agree. And as my colleague said, I mean, local communities are at the heart of everything we're doing. They have to be at the center of all of the work that we do. It's very good to hear the bank's work on finding ways to partner with non-state actors. Now, that's not something that, that's something that has to be in addition to the work that's already happening. There are contexts where that kind of work may be necessary. We have organizations like ICRC and UNHCR who are capable of working as an implementing partner. So we need more of this type of work in so-called fragile areas or in places where we have large number of displaced people. It can still be done in strong coordination and with the strong approval of national governments and local leadership. It doesn't have to be in parallel. And in fact, we don't want it to be in parallel. But that kind of work has to definitely be a part of the puzzle. And as Filippo knows very well, the bank already has some excellent windows, including the window for host communities and refugees. And we've seen it work in very effective ways and reach people directly in some of the poorest countries in the world. And what's wonderful about that window is that it ties necessary policy to resources, and that policy is aimed at forms of social and economic integration of refugees. So those kinds of windows have proven their effectiveness. We need additional tools like that. And I would underscore that in many of the places where we're working, We don't need, it's not about tens and tens of billions of dollars. That's not really the challenge at all, right? It's, in fact, the challenge is the opposite. It's getting smaller bits and bobs of funding from big institutions and using that in smaller projects. And everyone knows it's more difficult to do that. It's more labor intensive, it's more time intensive, and it's harder. But that's the direction we have to go if we want to make a difference in the places where we're all working.
Philippe, I wonder if you have a thought about that. It seems, when I talk to people in the humanitarian space, it's probably fair to say the humanitarian community broadly has failed at this, or at least has not lived up to the expectations, especially of local groups who say the funding isn't getting to us. It's staying, at the high levels. And as you just heard from Elizabeth, it is a hard thing to solve, right? In very risky environments. How do you get even small amounts of money, but in the hands of the right people? How are you trying to do that? How would you assess the opportunity to do that?
Yeah, I want to say something about that, but also something about Stefano's question about prevention, because I think it's an important topic. On local groups, on civil society, fully agree. I think that perhaps the most significant experience we've had in recent years of the importance of civil society, or these days we call this localization, was COVID, really, when everybody was away. And we had to continue, humanitarian assistance never stops. So we had to continue to deliver. And the only way to deliver was through groups that were present. But I can give you other examples. In Ukraine, sorry, I stray away from Africa, but in Ukraine, we work essentially with local groups. It's a question of access, it's a question of direct contact with the communities, it's a question of knowledge of risk, anyway, for many, many reasons. And today, I was in the General Assembly, we had an interesting event, on Sudan, in which, we all spoke, international organization, governments, we all said the same things. And then a Sudanese woman that has founded a small organization, activist organization, at the grassroots level, spoke out. And then it all made sense. She said, you should all be supporting me. You should all be supporting us in a situation in which access is catastrophic because of insecurity. Needs are escalating. And, the risk is that we all go in and waste resources because we don't have the right access. Channeling aid through groups like hers can really be effective and have the fundamental role of keeping civil society alive in a situation in which everything is against them, in which a country is being destroyed, basically, a nation is being destroyed. So many, many reflection on that. The challenges are the ones we know. Groups such as, local groups need capacity, need accountability. Aid is very complicated, to even humanitarian aid, not to mention development aid, is very complicated. So how do we empower this group? How do we really take that leap, that risk, and do that? But can I say one word about prevention? I should be, but I'm not an expert in prevention because I keep dealing with the opposite of prevention. But I see very much the importance of it, and I think this point is very important. I'd like to hear what the African Development Bank thinks about it, also in terms of resources. But, I often quote my own experience. It's a bit old, 20 years ago in Afghanistan. I served in Afghanistan 4 years after the fall of the Taliban. 4 years. That was an incredible opportunity, not only to rebuild a nation or to help a nation rebuild itself, but to prevent further slides into everything that we know. We failed. Let's face it. We all collectively failed. The Afghan leadership failed, and the international community that invested billions into that. I think it would be, I have my own thoughts about how it failed. But peace building, as I don't know if it's still called like that, is usually a failure because aid is too complex, too slow, and dare I say, too conditional, and therefore does not take the risks that are necessary, situations of peace building which are actually equal to prevention, because by rebuilding a country, you prevent its further slide into conflict, and also terrorism, and also everything else. But rebuilding a country that comes out of conflict means, again, we go back to the same problem, taking incredible risks, which the aid system is reluctant. And may I say a final point? All of this, supporting local groups, especially in conflict situation, or doing serious peace building, i.e. prevention, requires risks that the current political environment is becoming more and more reluctant to take, not the opposite. When I was a young field officer, we took an enormous risk. There was less scrutiny. Today, Congress or parliaments in Europe or decision makers regarding aid are allergic to any form of risk and block the necessary risky investments that are empowering local communities and are empowering and are allowing real prevention. So it's an issue for much discussion, but I think it's a very important one, very central to all that we're discussing today.
It is. So much comes down to the risk profile and the risk appetite, but at a moment when the reality of the world requires us to take a lot more risk. I wonder, if you can address this question about this pact that we have, right? So it wasn't clear we were going to get it. The Secretary General worked very hard. We now have a pact. It has this agenda for peace in it. How will you, as a leader of one of the biggest development finance institutions in the world, actually look to implement this?
Yeah. No, I wanted to address some of the critical questions I were asked, especially from the World Bank on the issue of how do you get the funds to, we don't fund directly, just like you. We don't go directly to communities and all that. But we have fiduciary agreements with UNHCR, World Food Program, that are actually in those areas of conflict. So we actually give the resources to them to manage, and they do a great job of it. So we'll continue to scale up our resources through those kind of mechanisms. I think Filippo was talking about the issue of absorptive capacity. So building capacities in many of those countries, many of those communities, community-based organizations, to be able to actually implement programs and then be able to have the results to go. I think it's also very, very important. So supporting the civil society organizations also to monitor what's being done, whether the results that are actually promised are actually being achieved, it's also quite important. On the Anthony question, and I'll come back to that on the part of your risk. Sometimes we have a facility at the bank that's called private sector facility, which essentially allows the African Development Bank to invest for private sector activities in areas that are fragile states. It's almost about $500 million now. We've done that program now for, more than about 5-6 years. We've only had one project in which it actually didn't work. So sometimes I think the risks are exaggerated. If you really know the communities and how you work with things, it's not as bad as people actually think. We put about $500 million there and we haven't lost any money. So I think that knowledge is important. That perception is not always reality.
The perceived risk among credit rating agencies, among private investors, is often far higher than the reality.
Yeah, far higher. Like in Kenya, for example, you're talking about Kenya. President Ruto told me that when Niger had a military coup, that the rating agencies for Kenya, just all of a sudden they had to pay 300, 500 basis point higher just because there was a coup in
1,000 miles away.
Yeah, and he said that last time he checked, Niger was not in Kenya, and so those things are like that. But on Stefano's point about prevention, I'm not an expert in the humanitarian space, but when I look at the issue though, where we have a lot of challenges, there's something I call for myself a disaster triangle. And that triangle have, extreme poverty. It also has the fact that you have structural unemployment for a lot of young people. mainly in rural areas. And you also have environmental degradation. Almost anywhere you find this, you always have all manner of terrorists that are there. So I think that if one wants to address prevention, we have to go back to those fundamental three things, right? So on the poverty side, you want to make sure that you are supporting small businesses to be able to do things. You're supporting the rural livelihoods, agriculture being a big one, because majority of the areas that are affected are rural areas. On the job side for the young people, you building skills, you bring education, you have financial vehicles that will support them to be able to actually turn their ideas into good businesses. Often, Raj, we talk about the young people, and I go around Africa, people say to me that there is youth empowerment programs, right? But I rarely find young people that walk up to me and say that to be empowered, right? And so I think that what we need are actually structural vehicles that allows us to have financing to support businesses of young people at scale. And that's why the African Development Bank is setting up right now something we call Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks across Africa. They're new financial institutions supporting the ideas, businesses, and ventures of young people, Australia is trying to create youth-based wealth all across Africa. And they will finance these businesses in a life cycle model for them. So I've never seen a young person that wants to fail. It's just that we failed them by not putting capital behind them. And in my view, if we have this demographic asset that we don't unlock by putting capital behind our young people, it will be the biggest risk that we've taken. And so we have to make sure we put our capital at risk for them so that they can succeed. Now, on the issue of the environment, we've talked about the building resilience against, for climate change adaptation, land degradation, issues that you have to deal with, water irrigation in areas that are actually dry land agricultural areas. Those are some of the things I feel that one can do. But I want to end on one thing. We have a program that we call Africa Disaster Risk Insurance Facility. This program allows us to insure countries against exogenous shocks, and it works very well. We've used it in Malawi, we've used it in Zimbabwe, we use it in Zambia, and also in Madagascar. We're trying to scale it down to about $1 billion that will allow us to reinsure countries on the global insurance market against many of these climatic shocks that leads to the kind of challenges that Philippines have to deal with. So I think we have to just look at also how to mitigate risk facing countries and risk facing individuals.
Letitia, I'm curious your thoughts on any of the questions, but in particular, you earlier talked about the challenges in urban environments, right? And how we're seeing more conflict spread in urban areas. You think about some of the infrastructure issues there, water and sanitation, health infrastructure, electricity. These should be under peaceful conditions, development challenges, investable areas really in the economy. When you think about the issue of prevention, is there anything we can do or more we can do to prevent or make more resilient those kinds of systems so when there is conflict or fragility, we're dealing with a better context there?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the question that we have today, and all the conflict settings that are keeping us very busy. And it's definitely all this question. I mean, as we perceive prevention is really protection of those essential services, preserving them from being collapsed, from being damaged, from being irremediably lost at times. And this really goes with trying to make sure that the human imperative is also prevailing in the moment where military objectives are, the key for those that are fighting. We need to put that really regularly on the table, particularly in areas where there's loss of authorities, but also loss of sight as well. At times, those discussions do not happen in the conflict that we talk the most, not only. And it's important that we really insist that there's a need to preserve and to make those systems resilient. So it's both maintaining it, allowing the personnel to come back to the hospital, to work, to fix, but also making sure that they can be quickly fixed if there is a damage, that militaries are also taking the precautionary measures, to avoid just bulldozing areas without even realizing the impact it has. Sometimes it amounts to that. It amounts to precautions in the attack that are not just taken because of misunderstanding of what's also around the areas. I think those cities under attack also require better precaution as well when it comes to fighting in those areas. And what we see is a lot of explosive weapons in populated areas. Those are just having massive impacts. It's not just fighting street to street. It's really amazingly impacting areas, neighborhoods, all the structures, the road that allow as well for the system to function, people to move around. So we really need to put that into the discussions. It's unfortunately a reality in many places. 50 million people in Africa live in areas controlled by non-state armed groups, and this is where we often have difficulties engaging, being present, also being present also by protecting as well at times, being also on the line as well of discussing with those that will have an impact by behaving differently. So we need to continue having this discussion. But it's extremely difficult because the reality is that this is often considered as a casualty of war.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, that it has massive impact that will take decades to cope with. It's just not it should not be understood as a quick reality that can be fixed further on. It's really having beyond capacity to fix and recover, will prolong the displacement of people, and basically disrupt the whole social network as well that existed before.
Well, listening to you, two things I'm taking away from the conversation, I want to hear what others think as we wrap up, is that, to the extent you can engage local people, civil society groups, local organizations, local businesses in the provision of these services, that adds some element of resilience, right? These are now services that maybe you can get started up again more quickly because they are truly locally rooted. But also that, if we think about these locations and these realities, they're going to be places where, yes, the humanitarian community is the only community that can go and serve, but there's also lots of areas around those places which need to be supported too, because they're close to a fragile region. And as a result, you might have spillover effects, and maybe other tools, including the tools of development finance, can work there. I wonder, Elizabeth, what are some of your thoughts now as we kind of wrap up this conversation that come to you, given that we have this pact for the future, given that we have this new moment, this renewed partnership here that we're hearing about, where do you want to see us as a community take this?
Thanks for that. Look, I'll try to end on a hopeful note and mention again, when the Secretary co-hosted the event on Monday, it was very important to the U.S. government that we had the State Department, we had our colleagues from USAID, from the Development Financing Corporation, from Treasury. Everyone sort of with one voice sort of saying everyone's tools, everyone's resources all at once. So part of the answer, part of the solution is, we as a big donor across all of these spaces have to make sure internally in our own systems, we're very cognizant of and aware of the financial flows, where they're going, how they intersect, or often not, and what the broad outcome we want in those places. It's very difficult, right? The way, and Filippo spoke to this, but how resources, why they're in place, how they're in place, what the legal authorities are around them. There's lots of reasons why that communication isn't that simple. But I think in a positive way, internally, inside, the vast government that is the United States, we are looking at these questions, we're talking to each other, and we're talking across all of these sectors, and we're trying to have a common approach. One last point I think I would make is just on the private sector. We believe that there has to be market-driven solutions to all of these crises about which we are speaking. There is no place really where in any of these crises that we're responding to, where there isn't some type of marketplace happening. So, and we also already know there's countless examples across the continent, some which we support, others that we've observed, where small scale or medium-sized businesses are working. Sometimes they're working with public resources, de-risking their initial investment. Sometimes it's blended finance. There's lots of different ways, but we're very committed to this, and we're increasingly looking at the ways in which we can use our own humanitarian resources to spur this type of work and move away from long-term protracted humanitarian assistance in places which basically keeps people alive. That is not the solution. We really have to look at using those resources, which, by the way, are much easier for us to raise in Washington than development resources. So it means on the humanitarian side, it's not just about waiting for the development actors. We really have to change some of the ways that we're spending our resources, who our partnerships are with, and be very cognizant and aware of, private sector and other actors around us. With even small bits of money, you can really start changing the paradigm and start building that ecosystem around some of these very, very hard to reach places that then is more sustainable and long term.
It's a really important point, and I'm sure many of us have witnessed that even in the most challenging circumstances, entrepreneurship can thrive, often very surprisingly. Philippe, I'd love to hear your final thoughts here. What are you taking away from this moment that we find ourselves in?
I will say something relatively simple, but I think it's something we need to reflect upon. We are already in a shift here. I'm glad that finally, after many years, we're not saying anymore we have to establish this nexus, right? The nexus is there. We are working on it. The question is how to get it right. The question is how to really forge these new partnerships. I think that's the key word. Partnership across the old divides towards the real goal here. I think of all the words that have been used, you used it a lot in the beginning, resilience is the key. How do we invest in resilience? Because development is ambitious, right? And presumes certain elements that are not always there in the situations we're talking about. Humanitarian is imperative, is useful, saves lives, but as Elizabeth just said, doesn't last, and then moves to another part of the world and it's lost, and then creates a dependency that can only produce misery. So resilience is the key word. Perhaps we should have, perhaps that should be the name of the nexus. How do we all contribute to resilience? And I think it's now I speak for us, the humanitarians. We need to also make a big shift. How do we ensure that what we do ensures resilience? That we are not always going through this reasoning. This is why partnering, if now we are partnered together. We are partners with the World Bank. We're partners with other IFIs, with development actors, which is pretty new for us. But this is not just a partnering to get different resources. It's a partnering to also learn ourselves how to direct our life-saving assistance in a manner that is also building resilience. Because people under duress, in conflict, post-conflict, in countries that are ruled by governments that nobody likes, all this variation of the fragility, people need resilience. Otherwise, otherwise either they die or they get displaced and refugees, or they become the source of fresh conflict. So it's part of prevention as well. So I think more reflection around this concept of resilience is quite crucial.
President Adesina, close us out with your thoughts. This is an important moment for you personally. This is your last year in this role. You are raising an unprecedented sum for the African Development Fund. You're bringing, as we've heard, an unprecedented number of tools to bear against this issue of fragility and for the idea of peace. What do you want to see come from this moment that we're in today?
Well, first is I think we have to work with those who actually understand delivering things in fragile and very, very difficult areas. So I see the African Development Bank expanding partnerships with UN agencies that are actually on the ground to be able to work effectively in these areas. And we have a lot of work that we do in that. So we'll continue to do that. Let them do what they know how to do best. We can deploy capital to them to do that work. I think that's the most efficient way to do it. Secondly, is that for us on the development side, whether it's on energy, water, sanitation, education, we want to make sure that leave nobody behind, right? Because that's the key. We want to reach everybody. It doesn't matter how difficult the environment is. So all the more reason why we have to link together to make sure that this works. The last thing that I want to say is that we heard a lot about the issue of reforms of the global financial architecture and all of that. But of what good is an architecture that you change it, but the pipe is still the same. It's still the way you deliver the support, and that's what I'm hearing. It's very, very important. So I mean, to the point that was raised by the person for the World Bank, and I think it's something we have to look at is our financing is basically given to sovereigns, but the sovereigns are far away from the issues on the ground. I think it's time for us to begin to look at how we give financing to subnationals that are very close to where the challenges really are. The issues will be, how do you build those institutions? How do you build their fiduciary capacities to be able to do that? And how do you make sure that they can actually have ability to raise money? I mean, if you can support them to have ability to raise municipal bonds, they will repair their roads, they will repair their water and sanitations, make their society, I mean, their environments much better for people. And I think that this is an agenda that I think if we want to actually get closer, we have to get closer to where the action is. So that's why I'm saying that the monies have to go closer to that. And one of the things that we can do is bringing mayors together, bringing the heads of those areas together to figure out, what do you need? What are your capacities that we have to build? How do we support you to be able to raise more money and use the money close on the ground? I think this is very, very important. We can't just do it from the top. We got to get close there. So I would say getting close back to the subnational financing is going to have to be a big agenda to be able to make this nexus work.
Well, I think getting all of us close together has been an achievement, and it's led to a really fantastic conversation. Please join me in thanking this panel. We're thrilled by this partnership. You know, I had a taxi driver ask me early in this week, is it really worth it, all this that you do here in New York this week, all the traffic, all the chaos? And I had a hard time answering him. I said, you know, think about what might happen otherwise. Think about the alternative to the UN, the alternative to these efforts. It's war, it's fragility, but actually there are things that happen this week that drive us in the right direction. This has been one of them, and it's been a real honor and pleasure to work with UNHCR, the African Development Bank, and all of you. Thank you for being here. We have a very special treat. So as our panel makes their way off the stage, I am thrilled to welcome to the stage, and please, another round of applause for the panel as they go. I'm thrilled to welcome to the stage Emi Mahmoud, the world champion poet and UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador known to so many of you. Emi is an advocate for peace, and we are just thrilled to have her join us today. Please. Such a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you heard some of that. I know you've been running around New York City, but we're thrilled we got you here today. You know, we're having in some ways a very technical conversation about development finance, but at the root of this is people and peace. And I wondered what your thoughts are about the themes that we're here to talk about today.
No, absolutely. And the thing is, I like that you just get straight to it. For me, it's very, very fundamental to what I believe, that it's important for us not to silo these conversations, right? So you mentioned I'm a Goodwill Ambassador for UNHCR. So excited to be here. But I studied anthropology and molecular cellular developmental biology at Yale, and I got a certificate in global health. I'm a scientist, but I choose poetry because I believe that when you speak to people politically, they'll respond politically. If you speak to them academically, they'll respond academically. If you speak with hate, they respond with hate. But when you speak with your humanity, they're compelled to respond with their humanity. And I think that's powerful.
That is absolutely powerful. What do you think? So I said at the outset, this is a time when it's very easy to feel depressed about the realities in the world. And of course, we're talking about some heavy topics, some places where there is outright conflict and war. What gives you the sense of hope and opportunity that you bring to the stage like this and so many others around this town?
Thank you so much. For me, it's really, really important to talk about fragility, but also to understand that the people who are most affected are actually the people who are most equipped and most knowledgeable in being able to actually create the solutions that can last a very long time. I'm the newest and youngest investment committee member for Grand Challenges Canada. It's one of the biggest development funds in the world. It's Impact First. And when I'm there, I get to drive solutions that actually create ownership in our communities. So the reason that I'm saying that this gives me hope, or it makes me feel like we can create hope and conflict, is that in these, it's actually, that's the name of one of our portfolios, is that when I tell you that I'm from Darfur, or I'm from Sudan, or that I'm a former refugee, or that I work in some of the most harrowing contexts of our time, it tends to make people feel sad, right? And then they immediately turn to the stigma, the feeling that those of us who have lived experience, that lived experience doesn't necessarily translate to professional experience. And I think that needs to change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is very easy to have a two-dimensional view about places far away where you may be different from where you grew up, and to think there's nothing possible there, that these are places that are going to be consigned to fragility or conflict. But when you meet people, as we heard on this panel, the closer you get to the actual ground, you talk to the people, young people, entrepreneurs, leaders on the ground, the more you realize actually there's enormous potential. There's incredible assets there. I loved what President Adesina had to say, that he's never met a young person who asks for youth empowerment, but they like to get into business. You know, they've got ideas, and I feel like there's a real difference when you get to the people themselves and talk to them, and get away from, as you say, some of the two-dimensional ideas we might have.
I love that. And the thing is, late Commissioner Ogata once said, and it's my favorite quote, so I say it all the time, that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. When people hear this, they believe that it means there's no solutions at all, right? But what she meant is that there are political solutions, there are state solutions, there are business solutions, there are investment solutions. There are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems, because humanitarian problems aren't caused by our humanity, but they can be solved by our humanity. And I think that that's why those of us who are on the ground and have been on the ground for so long, like I started as a grassroots activist. I was a public speaker when I was 10, and have been fundraising since then, right? Naturally, when you're on the ground trying to solve these issues, you have to be a policy strategist. You have to be an entrepreneur. You have to be an investor, investing whatever it is that you have in those moments. And you make a little bit go a very long way. Any other place in the world, that would be seen as revolutionary or, entrepreneurial or genius, right? But on the continent, because of the stigma, and in refugee communities, because of the stigma and the misunderstanding about our humanity and our intelligence and our ability to actually create the changes, it's just seen as, oh, it's so sad that they have to do that. Change the narrative, and then put the investments in those spaces. That's what I'm trying to do now, because I'm starting an impact fund myself. I'm like, well, if they're not going to do it, we'll do it ourselves. Yeah.
That's the right attitude. And I love that the current High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, really said that humanitarianism on its own is not the solution, exactly. Right? It's necessary. You have to save people. It's the mission, but it's not the solution, as you say. And that does require a new way of thinking, I hope we brought to this stage in this event today, as we move on to having a cocktail and gathering with our friends and collaborators here, to think that, yes, here in the world today, if you open any newspaper, it doesn't look good, but go talk to somebody doing the work. Yeah. And that's really a lot of our community at Devex, and you will walk away with a different feeling.
That's beautiful. I think also something really, really, really important before I close this out with a special treat, is that, a lot of people believe that a lot of these issues, that we're dealing with, just the fact that Sudan is now the biggest displacement crisis of our time. 10 million people have been displaced in the span of a year, right? The war started about a year ago, a little over. I've lost 14 family members since then. But I can sit here and talk to you with hope and inspiration, because I feel that, we're at the precipice of possible change. And I think that in these moments where you're seeing all of this chaos and all of these shifts, it's actually the perfect time to double down on the beliefs that we need to solve these issues. These are not catastrophes or crises or things that just happen. These are things that are man-made, right? So even the famine in Sudan is man-made. But beyond the famine in Sudan being man-made, the gender gap and the digital divide are man-made, and so many other business issues like inequality and food deserts and health crises, they're all man-made. And I think that they can be solved by our humanity because problems have solutions. And I think the most innovative person, the smartest and most, revolutionary mind is somebody on the ground, on the continent, a refugee, someone who is not only on the front line of crisis, but at the forefront of change. And we need to start talking about it that way. When people don't see these things coming to fruition, they don't necessarily feel the desire to actually support it. It's almost like sometimes because governments and institutions and such don't want to engage with risk, we have only our bodies to engage with risk. I think what I've seen is that you almost have to show them that it's possible for people to believe that it's possible. And that brings me to the last thing that I want to say. It's why when we started working on civilian peace, I don't know how many people know this, but I walked 1,000 kilometers across Sudan and mobilized thousands of people across the way ahead of the revolution. And then I worked on the peace agreement in 2020, and I've been working on civilian peace since then. What does peace have to do with all of it? Well, Filippo said it. We need to actually nip these problems in the bud, because the reality is if you don't solve crisis where it's at, you're going to be dealing with so much more displacement. Before the war, there were 2 million internally displaced people who have been displaced for 20 years. Ignoring the displaced people, ignoring my family, ignoring the issues that we've been facing, trying to brush things under the rug means that now we have 8 million internally displaced people. I'm upset, but I'm also proud to say that we were able to reach 12,000 people in 10 days with our peace initiative.
Incredible.
And have civilian recommendations for peace on the negotiation table. And we're going to try to reach tens of thousands or millions more to try and create civilian peace, because I think that the conversation around peace and solving these issues is about responsibility, asking people not only what you want for peace, but what will you do for peace. And that's really, really important. And that's the conversation that we have. And we need to set the precedent of understanding that people who are living it every day are the people who should be having these technical talks. It's not something that is, above or beyond them. It's not something that they can't talk about. Yes, exactly. It's not something they can't talk about because there's famine. I can't tell you how many times I've heard even officials who've worked in the U.S. government before, and people who are experts in the space say, "Oh, with the famine and everything else going on in Sudan, or with refugees dealing with the crises that they're dealing with, they don't have time or they don't have the expertise to talk about peace, to talk about conflict resolution, to talk about change." But the reality is, we always say with refugees, not at refugees or for refugees, right? So help us with our peace initiative, help us with whatever else you want to help with, and, help us prove that it's important to invest in our communities.
Well, you are inspiring us with both your words and your actions
Thank
tonight.
you.
Thank you so much.
This is the
Am I going to leave the stage?
the poem. Yeah. All right, now that I've
leave
said
the stage to you, because you've got a special treat that we're all in.
It's so funny because I was actually supposed to start with the poem, but I was like, well, I'm not going to tell Raj that. So now this poem, it's actually, it's hard to share because it actually frames the urgency of what we're dealing with. I know that we're all here talking about these things in these ways that make it more acceptable to speak about it. But the reality is that this is very urgent and it's happening in real time. Our people are out of time. And I think that with the minds in this room and the campaigns that we've started, the campaign that I run, Taharruk, it brings together SAPA and several other of the civilian-led organizations on the ground. That's about 9 million civilians that we can reach. So this is Sudan Baladi, and the reason I want to share this poem today is to remind everyone what's at stake here. When a startup fails or when an initiative fails, it's like, oh, it failed, it's part of the process. But these investments in these things, if they fail, it's life or death for us. And so that's why we need every single hand on deck. This is Sudan Baladi. Another war came crashing down on our bodies. The cut of a broken piece and the bite of a broken promise are the same. Except with the first one, death follows and takes everyone around you. Back home, our skin is green. because we're full of life. A full life looks so different when it's poured out onto the rubble, rotting in the streets. Every university became a grave, every garden a final resting place. Our brothers and sisters fall faster than we can dig the holes. On the receiving end of the bullet is a little girl, a mother, a family, a home. Airstrike, Sahoy, Adana, airstrike, Sahoy, Adana. Blood on the streets of Khartoum and Al-Ubaid. Blood in the wadis of Niyala and Janana. In the mountains of Al-Fashir, the pyramids of Marawi. Blood across the skies of our beautiful country, Sudan. Baladi. Who did this to you, my love? Who stripped you bare and turned all your children loose? The bodies fall, they don't stop. The killing starts, we don't run. Hoping against hope that it's a mistake. That if we sit quiet and still enough, maybe it'll stop. That if our hearts beat loud enough, they'll know that we're human. That we bleed the same blood. That we bleed the same blood. Who decides who lives or dies? My uncle Abdulaziz walked home from prayer. The bomb soared down from above and took him and 4 neighbors away from us. Sunrise saw my cousin Ammar on the way to college, my uncle Ibrahim arresting at home. Each found a bullet, each found an end. One on the first day, one on the second, another soon after. My uncle Ibrahim Ahmed lost his life when the hospital shuttered, became more dangerous than the disease that robbed him. I held my mother as we cried for her brother, for all of our people across Sudan. Our families broke fast together one night and planned burials together by morning. The next day comes and there's nowhere to run. My country falls to pieces and my people go missing one by one. Roads covered, rubble still bleeding, sent to the bottom of a crater, reduced to a footnote in a world said to be in crisis. First orphans, now refugees. For the first time, the second or the third home is burning. See the buildings falling. See the fire flashing. Hear the people evaporating before our eyes. The hospitals filled with the wounded and our lungs filled with ash. Then the hospitals shuttered and the borders too. And the headlines named our killers, but not us. And the world keeps moving. And the people whisper it's a mystery. And their names turn to memories in our mouths. Their names turn to memories in our mouths. A country without its people, a people robbed of time. How can I explain what it's like to sleep and not wake up, or to wake up and know that it happened again, and you're oceans away, crying, praying, pleading for our voices to be heard, dying for our lives, literally dying for our lives. In my country, wars have ended, but peace has never come. Who bought the bullets? Who pulled the trigger? Who sold the guns? Who decides who lives or dies? Who decides who lives or dies? Tell me how to make it stop. Tell me how to make it stop. Who will bring the peace? Who will stop the war? Sudan, Baladi, who did this to you, my love? My country, can you hear me? My country, can you hear me? Thank you, everyone. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emi Mahmoud. Thank you so much, UNHCR. Thank you, African Development Bank. Thank you to all of you joining us online, all of you in the room. We have a reception in the back. Thanks again.